Hi folks, you're with Tacitus today, your pushback channel. Thank you for joining this audio live stream. In this essay, I'd like to talk about a number of movies I've seen and docudramas, and they've all been made at roughly the same time. And looking at the sources of funding, all the roads seem to lead back to a core set of NGOs and so on. So clearly it's coordinated, it's planned, it's it's orchestrated, it's international. And the purpose of all these movies, docudramas, and so on is to delegitimize all the accomplishments of the modern white Western industrial sort of era. Given that Britain was kind of the launch pad of the, well, not kind of, it was the launch pad of the modern industrial revolution, and because they had the lead technically and so on pretty much all the other areas around the world, they were able to export their not only their technology but their legal systems and procedures, the public service administrative procedures, and so on. And so Britain's really, if you want to delegitimize modern white history, and you want to delegitimize white accomplishments, you must destroy Britain and its empire and delegitimize it and attack it and accuse it of all sorts of things. And then the richest country in the world being the United States, again, a white country, then you have to destroy it. That's why Britain and the United States come in for particular attack by the globalists to delegitimize it. And the delegitimizing is that anything at all that comes after the British American thing or the white thing, the modern industrial, anything is better than what went before, because look how bad it was. Look how bad it was. They're all fucking Nazis. So this is the direction that the propaganda campaign's taken. So there are three main ones. I mean, there are others, but there are three main vectors of attack, if I can call it that. One is the British in India. The other is the British in Ireland. And then the British sort of more generally, I guess, around in the empire. But I'll deal with another one that's actually kind of, and I'll use this. In fact, I'll use this as an example as well. Is when the British had that brief mandate in Palestine immediately before the creation of the Jewish state of Israel. That also is coming in. In fact, been a couple of vicious movies I saw about that. Now they're all, whilst they have grains of truth in them, they're all hysterical propaganda, and so I'll talk about these. They are deliberately made and constructed and set up to attack and delegitimize and just make the British Empire and Britain, white people, straight white people, look bad, and that's the purpose. These movies and docudramas have no purpose other than that, and they go about it with some intensity. So let's talk about and there's quite a few, so I won't pick on any one per se, but rather look at them generally and the message they're putting across. So let's have a look at, say, the British in India. Now, the Indian nationalists, by the way, the Indians are falling over themselves to flock to Britain. So this evil fascist Nazi white supremacy, and Indians are gagging by the hundreds of millions to flock to white countries. But at the same time, the Indian nationalists are saying all these white countries are evil. But obviously the Indians are quite happy to say, that's right, those damn white people, they're all evil. But they aren't the people that want to go to, they all want to go to these white countries on one hand, and the other want to say they're all Nazis. So I made a few notes, and I should have pulled those up first, but it's quite a bit here. Now, in the case of India, they focus on to sort of what's referred to generically as the Indian mutiny or the Indian uprising, which is sort of shortly after the Crimean War. So we're talking 1857, 1858, that type of time frame. And then again in the early early 1920s, and the Amritsar thing was the big deal there, and the Indian nationalists and the activists and the stirrers like jumping on these too. But we'll talk about the British Raj. Now the Europeans came to India to trade mainly for spices, but the Portuguese sort of kicking off first, and then there was not so much the Spanish, a little bit the Spanish, but then the French, the Dutch, and the British. Now, due to the various wars that between the French, the Dutch, and the British, particularly the 7 Years' War, 1756 to 1763, the British came out in front by a decent margin, and so they became the bigger player in the trade of the Indian continent. India was in a state of absolute turmoil when the Europeans arrived. They were being invaded in the north by the Islamists, coming through Persia and Afghanistan, and or modern day Iran and Afghanistan coming in through the north. And you still see the residue of that today with Pakistan and Bangladesh and so on. And then there was effectively most of India, other than a couple of provinces that were reasonably stable, were in a constant state of civil war and so on. So the whole place was in absolute turmoil. Now, the British wanted to trade in spices. They were happy to just have some coastal villages and ports and so on that they could trade from. But they found that the constant state of civil war and cutting deals with local warlords and the like, these warlords would renege on the deal and say refuse to honour the contract they'd agreed to previously. The British then used force of arms to make sure that the local officials adhered to the contract they'd signed. And then they were finding that because of the civil wars and the strife, that the transport from where the spices or whatever it was were grown and transporting it to the coast where the British ships could pick them up, that was constantly under threat and constantly being attacked by armed brigands and so on. And the local authorities just didn't have the power or the ability to do it, and would often demand the British paid extortionate bribes. We'll stop the criminals stealing all your stuff, but you have to pay us a bribe. And the British were often finding that the criminals, in fact, were employed by the local warlords to harass the British interests, simply so the warlord could extract more, extract money from the British and so on. So they decided, okay, the British decided, as indeed the French and the Dutch would have done, was okay, we've got to protect our interests here, so we have to make sure that we can transport all these things from the area of production to the ports. Therefore, we have to have a presence in India, and we have to make sure that these local warlords stop their petty little civil war carry on with other areas and so. So that was the architecture of how the British. I don't think the British ever intended to actually take over India in order to make the place peaceful, and in order to stop the constant petty warfare and to protect their commercial interests. They ended up having to get involved in India. Now, the Brahmins, the upper caste, of course, hated this because they presented themselves to the masses as demigods, and so they were supplanted in their demigod status. And to this day, they've never forgiven the British for that. And the Indian nationalists primarily come from or are funded by this Brahmin group that, again, it still sticks in their craw today. Now, if we look at the Indian, the Indian situation there, it was it's hard to. India's been a nation of the weather changing and the constant famines. The famines just never stopped. Now, there were cycles in the monsoon season where you'd have massive floods, then dries, and then famines, and so on. So this was all part of Indian life. Now, the people that were most vulnerable to it were the lowest level of tenant farmers, the untouchables in Indian society. Now, they're on the bottom of society because they're supposed to have committed misdeeds in a previous life, and they've reincarnated into the bottom of the, if you like, the social structure, and that's the penalty they're paying for, again, their bad behavior in a previous life. Therefore, their death and their misery and their suffering is of no consequence to the upper caste Indians, because they're getting their just desserts, these people. So before the Europeans arrived, the Indian population, 150 plus million, whatever it was, when the Europeans started to arrive, millions upon millions were dying all the time, but because they were at the bottom caste, nobody cared. So infant mortality was 50% and this sort of thing. Now, when the Europeans arrived, the mortality rate went down quite considerably, not least because they stopped the civil wars. But when the famines occurred, whether they were of the same severity or not, when the Europeans or the British were there, then the Indian nationalists today point to say, look at that famine there and all the millions of people that died. That's because of those damn fucking white fucking British colonialists. Decolonizing must go ahead of pace. And so they're very, very selective in this. And it's quite irritating to them to pretend that there was never any famines or never any monsoons and never any floods before the British arrived, and all these things only happened the minute the British did arrive. And what a load of fucking bullshit. But that's the stuff that's being put about. Now, the effort that the British maybe didn't handle things as well as they could, but you could always look with hindsight, say, well, they could have done this, they could have done that, or why didn't they do so and so? But the fact is that the famines were, when they did occur when the British were there, were a much larger population. The population sort of had doubled from when the British arrived. So the effect of any famine would be greater. There are a few other things that occurred. The British had put in quite substantial irrigation, due to their engineering technology that hadn't existed before. And this caused thousands upon thousands of acres of land to be available for cultivation, which the peasant farmers occupied. And because of this increased prosperity, of course, they procreated more, and the population increased substantially. Now, I look at just a couple of famines. When the British were there, when the British were putting in rail lines, which the Indians, the India was about 600 years technologically behind Britain when the British were sort of there and a substantial presence. So there's no way they could have put rail or deep water ports or port facilities and anything like the extent, irrigation, bridges. They couldn't have done any of those things as the British were doing. So it's much more effective at farmers being able to sell their produce, for example, and move it around quickly. But they had rail lines in, so when there was an area of famine, the British had, assuming the rail line ran there, they had a facility to move food pretty quickly from an area that had plenty or surplus to an area that had a shortage. And given these peasants sort of live hand to mouth, they've only got to miss a couple of weeks of their already minimal diet and the heavy work and farming, and they'd all become ill and so on. So there'd be the effects would be felt fairly quickly in the case of a famine, which could be caused by a flood or a drought or whatever. But the British were not in full control of all the aspects of these things. So the bigger Indian farmers or the bigger Indian landlords would still demand that the peasants pay their full taxes, which would be in, say, grain, for example, or rice, something like that. They would collect that, but then they would refuse to distribute it to the starving peasants. So in areas where there was surplus, the Indian merchants just refused to sell it, and so the British they wanted the British to pay top dollar to distribute food relief to the peasants. The Indian upper class didn't see they had any obligation at all to the peasants. None, absolutely none. They were tax cattle, end of story. And if they died by the millions, hey, too bad. They're at the bottom strata of society. That's their lot to die. It's our lot to be demigods, and that stayed. So the Indians upper class didn't see they had any obligation to the peasants at all. If there was any obligation, it was still, well, if too many of them die, we'll have less taxes. But even this was offset by, we'll just give the remaining people bigger blocks of land, as in farming land, and then we'll tax them all the heavier to make up for the lost revenues from all the dead peasant farmers we can no longer tax. So the Indians were hardly cooperative. The Indian upper classes were hardly cooperative and didn't see why the British were concerned. What do you give a shit about these people? They're the bottom strata of society. Now, the British tried a number of things which were unsuccessful. For example, they had in the areas that were affected by famine, they would bring the people together into an area where they, at the end of a railhead, where they could supply food, so they could bring it in on the trains in bulk and then feed all these people. But in order to do that, because the drama of distributing it across such a wide area, so they'd bring the starving farmers, starving peasants rather, into an area where they could supply it in one drop, if you will. And because these people were so confined, then there were outbreaks of diseases like cholera and diseases to do with inadequate sanitation. And the British would attempt to say, well, you can't drink the water that you defecate in, but the peasants weren't really sort of responsive to good quality medical advice, and so there were diseases which killed many that the medical science at the time, the 1850s and the like, couldn't deal with. So it ended up that in these famines that occurred, there were large-scale deaths, but there'd always been. The British attempts to solve it were, modest success, you would say. Again, the diseases killed a lot of people, but also when the rich Indian merchants demanded that the British pay 10 times the market price for grain to feed the peasants, the British refused, and the rich Indian merchants said, well, that's it, I'm not selling the grain until I can get top dollar price. So the Indians would hoard grain in order to prevent the peasants getting any grain, in the hope that the British would pay top dollar to release the grain to the peasants. If the British didn't or refused, the Indian merchant would then refuse to sell the grain and would continue to hoard it. So then the peasants died by the million, and the Indians stood by and watched. So this idea that it was a uniquely British thing is, of course, absurd, but this is how it's painted today. Now, when we look at, say, the Indian Mutiny of 1857, 58, the causes were primarily the rich upper class felt they'd been displaced by the British, and that the rich upper class had been in full support of habits such as or cultural habits such as if a husband dies, the wife has to be burned alive on the funeral pyre, and things like that. And the British were stopping that the infanticide, which was widespread, especially the killing off of female babies and that sort of thing. So the British were putting a stop to a lot of these things, and this was again annoyed the upper class, because that was all part of their shtick for overawing the rich, the privileged classes, of overawing the masses. And also the British wanted to have equality before the law, which the Indian upper class was outraged by. This equality. We have equality with those damn peasants. You got to be kidding. So a lot of this disquiet with the British or the European, it could have been any European power, but the British presence was such that the Indians were, or those caste of Indians were keen to do. Also, there are other things, like there were professional robber murderers who were apparently skilled in the art of pretending to be somebody's friend, and then they'd get them off to a quite prearranged quiet place, and they'd be people would sort of these professional stranglers. They'd have their special strangling cord, would leap out from the bushes and put a cord around the neck of the unsuspecting folks and strangle them. Apparently, they were expert at it. They could kill you in seconds. I don't know whether this is, but this was a widespread thing. I suppose equivalent to the English highwayman. But the highwaymen would just take your money, and they would target the rich people. These Indian professional Indian brigands. Anybody who was going along the road who had anything worth stealing was fair game. So they tens of thousands of people were being murdered all the time by these professional murderer thieves. The British put a stop to that. But apparently, it was considered in India as at the time was considered to be an honourable profession, because if you were so skilled that you could deceive someone into believing you were their friend when in fact you weren't, you were intending to kill them. If you were that good at deception, then that made you a pretty sort of special person. You were skilled not only deception but murder as well, and so this was quite prestigious. There were ballads and songs written about these people and their exploits. Something you still, I still detect that today in the Indian. I think that ability to deceive. If you're a skilled deceiver, then you're a pretty sharp dude, and it's perceived so, and still perceived as, I think, honourable in a number of ways today. And remember, we're importing tens of millions of these people into the West who all believe that deception is a skill. An honourable skill. So anyway, so there was a certain amount of resentment. The people who had been doing well through a very dysfunctional and criminal and very cruel society in many ways, the British put a stop to a lot of these things, and so there was an uprising by those people who felt they'd been disadvantaged, and it spread sort of fairly rapidly amongst various parts of India, and white people were being massacred, and women and children being massacred, and so on. It was a pretty unpleasant sort of time, and the British responded. And you can imagine the language that was being used. Same as today with that Arab-Israeli thing. Whoever can say swastika the most times, whoever can say Holocaust the most times, has the moral advantage, and it's the same sort of thing there. If you could describe in the goriest detail things were happening, then you had the moral advantage over the other guy. So anyway, the rebellion, mutiny, call it what you like, was put down with as much brutality as it was prosecuted on the other side. And the Indian nationalists, though, today point to that as being, look at the brutality of those damn white people, whilst leaving out the indiscriminate massacre of white people, including the women and children, of course, that occurred during that time. And again, as I mentioned about the famines being very, very really cherry picking the famine thing and pretending that it was all orchestrated, administered intentionally by the British. Well, look at all the black, brown Indians who died. It must have been white supremacy, fucking Hitler. And they just go down that path and ignore the facts. And it's interesting how many of these people get gigs to do talks on the current affairs shows, news segments, and all sorts of things like that. And they get these. They're allowed to spout the most outrageous lies, and they don't get challenged or questioned any of it. Now, the other one was the Irish potato famine. Now, this potato famine is something that is sort of gone into folklore now, and it's used to bash the British Empire, that it's some sort of purposeful, willful, piece of evil, and the evil British Empire, and again, it's this overall de-legitimizing. Now, we need to sort of go back a little bit in history. When there was this guy called Martin Luther. I think most people have heard of that in Germany, or a province of Germany at the time. Now, he had a problem with what he perceived as quite rightly in my view, but perceived as a corruption of the Catholic Church. Now, the Catholic Church was very much involved in the temporal politics of Europe at the time. Remember, Europe was not a bunch of nation states as we would perceive it, or as it later on became. It was quite a patchwork of petty principalities. So in order to get a coordinated action in anything, the only binding force really was religion, which was the church. And so the Catholic Church played a very big role in the overall geopolitics, if you like, of the European region. Now, given the role it played, it needed money to be able to fund armies and subsidize various actions that they thought were helpful to the Christian sort of faith. So they needed money to do it, and they were big players in this, so their expenditures were huge. So they're always desperately trying to raise cash. And one of the expedients they resorted to was selling passports to heaven, and so people could engage in the most heinous crimes and then go to the church and say, well, can you give me a passport to heaven? Yeah, all your sins will be forgiven if you hand over enough cash. And also there was the Spanish Inquisition, so the chasing out of demons and those in league with the devil and so on. And if you're rich enough, you could give the Catholic Church a bunch of money, and then instead of actually burning you in reality, as in burned at the stake, you would be burned in effigy. So you could stuff a few clothes with some straw or something like that, and that they'd burn that, and you'd handed over the money. So they were big players. Now, Martin Luther, he had a problem with this. He's saying, well, that's corrupt. You're selling passports to heaven, and people should not have to go through priests. One of the problems he perceived was people had to go through priests to the Catholic priests, the clergy, to be able to communicate with God, whereas Martin Luther thought that the people should have a direct relationship with God. And this became part of the Protestant movement, which spread to England. Now, Ireland stayed Catholic. Now, the church was always very keen, Catholic Church was always very keen to bring England back into the fold, as in a Catholic nation. So they were constantly meddling and conspiring with the Irish. And remember, the population of Ireland and England wasn't that different at the time. They were constantly meddling in Irish affairs and trying to get Catholic troops from, whether it be from France or Spain or anywhere, it didn't matter, to get Catholic troops transported to Ireland. From there, they would, get supplied, and then they would launch an invasion of England. So Ireland was a constant threat, even given the Catholic Protestant thing, a constant threat to England, and there were hundreds upon hundreds of raids by Catholic raiders on the English coast and so on. So now when Oliver Cromwell came along in the English Civil War, one of the biggest threat is that the English perceived at the time was that given they'd cut the head off a pro-Catholic king, was that the forces of the Catholic Church would try and restore the monarchy and restore a Catholic head at in the position of King of England, and they would launch that invasion out of Ireland. So Cromwell, the English, what was called the Lord Protector at the time, he went over to Ireland with an army and with the sole purpose of crushing all the possible chance that the Irish Catholics, and remember it was a Protestant Catholic thing, this would do. So anyway, that was it. And the days of Cromwell and the armies, the English armies with Cromwell or his lieutenants at the head, rampaging the length and breadth of Ireland. But this was part of the Irish, the Catholic Protestant thing, which was wars that were raging across Europe as well. The Spanish Catholic armies were, trying to invade northern, what would later become northern Germany, because that's where the Protestant, Martin Luther and all that stuff came from. So there's a long history of drama and angst. The Danes, for example, invaded Ireland. What was it, 800 or 900 AD? They established Dublin. Dublin is a Danish or a Viking city, if you will. And then from there, they used to launch raids along the English and Welsh coast and so on. So this idea that suddenly the English decided to give Ireland a hard time is not true. Now, because the Irish constantly were conspiring with the Catholic forces, not that the Catholics weren't in there agitating and stirring, they were. Because of that, the English decided, well, we got to institute an area of control over Ireland, because as long as they remain Catholic, as long as they remain susceptible to Catholic Church agitation, and as long as they're planning military invasion of England, as long as that's engaged, we've got to keep control of this. It's just too dangerous to have that sort of knife poised at our back, and so they went in. So this idea that there's no reason for it, they just did it because they hated the Irish. That's bullshit, absolute bullshit. Now, coming to so there's a long history of this, of drama between the two areas. So now coming to the Irish potato famine. Now, the Irish potato famine was it's presented today as the English probably just did that, and it was and that's bullshit. There was depending on whose numbers you look at, between 25% and a third of the Irish diet at the time, this is the time of the potato famine, was potatoes. So what are we looking at? 1846, 47, I think it was, when it started. So the potato famine was a blight that affected the potatoes and which substantially reduced the crop. Now, there's a few things sort of went wrong here. The allegation is the English deliberately engineered the whole. I don't believe that. And the second thing, if it falls over, if the first attempt at saying, well, the English engineered the potato famine, if that falls over and can't be held up, they'll move to the second stage, which is the English didn't do enough, or the English then deliberately prevented relief efforts. I don't believe that either. And the third stage is that the English could have done more with relief efforts, the food relief efforts for the starving people. That could and probably does have some merit. So let's have a look at that now. But even here, there's nuance. Now, there's no way that anyone looking forward, looking into the future, could have seen the extent of the potato famine. It lasted for like 7 years, or 6 or 7 years, which I don't think anyone would have predicted. It was seen at first as just being a one-off event, that year's crop was affected, but in future everything would be fine. So the magnitude of it was never sort of understood, nor could it have been by anybody. That the fact it went for 6 or 7 years, or 6 or 7 harvests, it would have been beyond anyone's comprehension. So the idea that the British somehow magically knew how long it would go for is utterly absurd. And no one knew how the blight had arrived, in absolute precise terms, and why it only affected certain parts of Ireland and not others. And no one knew how long it would be before it would end. Now, the government, you can look at the time, say the government of Robert Peel, but the government did try to act fairly quickly, and buying say, vast amounts of corn or grain generally from, say, America or elsewhere, and bringing it in at cheap prices in order to feed the starving people. Now, this actually had the opposite effect of what was intended. And this is one of the things where good intentions aren't enough. But so the English imported, gazillions of tons of grain from wherever they could buy it. Remember, this was being bought at the English taxpayers' expense, and they were bringing it in and then distributing it now at very cheap prices, just so the people. Because remember, the farmers who were growing. Not only is there not enough food to go around because the potato crops fail, but the farmers that would sell their potato crop, they're also doing it tough because they've got no produce to sell. So their income has been disrupted. So the English then were distributing all this grain at very low, artificially low prices because people couldn't afford to pay market prices. But then that had the perverse effect where the Irish farmers who were growing grains and growing those sorts of things, they cut back their production or their farming, because with all this cheap grain around, they couldn't. Why would they grow crops that they couldn't sell even enough to cover the cost of their production? So they thought, well, with all this cheap grain around, they didn't know how long the English would be distributing the cheap grain. So the Irish farmers cut back their own production because they couldn't sell at a profit. They couldn't sell their grain at a profit in the market. So they cut back. So then there was an overall reduction in grain or foodstuffs generally because they couldn't get their money back on it. So this is where the perverse effect of market economics, where if you tinker with one side of the equation, it has unexpected effects on the other side. There are also various other things the English did, such as putting public work gangs together and then giving people. They didn't like the idea of just paying people for doing nothing or feeding people for doing it. So if you do public works, we'll give you food and that sort of thing. Now there was. I don't think, I'm just reading it now, I don't think that worked very well. I mean, again, the intention was probably reasonable, but people were having to, the public works area were in areas where the famine wasn't, in full swing. So you need to have the public works in areas where the starving people are, so you can feed them in situ rather than get them to move hundreds of miles in some other place. That doesn't work, and then you've got to accommodate them. That then becomes other logistical issues. So it wasn't. I don't think it was that well handled, and whether it was intentional or not, I mean, I don't believe that. Now, the next thing the English government did was, rather than have people moving around the place, they thought reasonably that the big landowners, because remember, a lot of these potato farmers, they're tenant farmers. They don't own the land themselves. So they're tenant farmers. So the English government said to the bigger landowners who've got all the tenant farmers who are starving, they say, well, it's your job to handle poor relief. You have to feed these people. And so we'll supply the support to you, but you have to feed them and prevent starvation and so on. Nobody wants masses of angry, starving people roaming the streets. Nobody wants that. So the idea that the British deliberately wanted that, the English wanted that, is absurd. Nobody wants millions of starving, angry people roaming around. That's a tinderbox waiting to go up. So once the English government did this and said, well, the owner, the big landowners have to pay for it, what the landowners started, and these are Irish people, by the way, Irish born and everything, and what the landowners did was they thought, shit, how can we avoid that liability for looking after these tenant farmers? What we'll do is we'll eject these tenant farmers from our land. So once they're not tenant farmers on our land, then we're not obligated to look after them as in providing poor relief or food and so on. So this was very cynical. Now, I think, going back, looking at it, that the English government was very slow to realise that was going on and thought that, again, it was a temporary aberration. but it wasn't. The big landowners thought, well, why should I pay poor relief to these damn fucking peasants? An attitude we're returning to today in the West, by the way, generally. Why should I give a fuck about the peasants? I'm a rich globalist. I'm a sophisticated globalist. Why should I care about my fellow citizen peasants? So that was very much the attitude there. So these tenant farmers were being ejected, but they had nowhere else to go. This is where you saw the large immigration to the United States and claims of starvation. Now the numbers vary depending on how firebrand the the recollection is, but there's claims of up to 1 million people died in the Irish famine. Now I don't know, that seems a little bit juiced up to me, but let's assume for the moment it's true. Then how do we apportion out the blame? Do we say it's failed policies? Do we say it's willful, evil, Nazi, fascist British Empire? Do we say it's the Irish people doing things to themselves, as in doing to their fellow citizens? The landowners ejecting the tenant farmers so they didn't have to give them poor relief and so on. The list goes on. The refusal of the tenant farmers to move to areas where there were food surpluses, for example. Why didn't the English government do more to keep bringing in grain? Why didn't they subsidise the farmers to grow food and then pay them so that the production rate of food would keep up, and then they could have distributed that as poor relief? Now you can go back in time. Again, the British government or the English government didn't know how long the thing was going to go for, so you can see that the policies they put in place were only to last 6 months or a year. They were thinking very short term, but how would they know that it was going to be 6 or 7 years? They didn't. They just assumed it would be a one-off event. But they kept on each year. They kept on assuming, well, this will be the last year. The next year will be fine. And so the policies, I believe, that they put in place, well-meaning as some of them were inadequate to cope with the duration of that. Was it evilness? And I don't believe so. I don't see any example of that there. Can you find some examples of where some would have said, well, that's a good thing because the Irish are always troublesome because of their Catholic connection and because of their support of invasions of Protestant England? Well, sure, you could find those. Does that mean the whole thing was a contrivance along those lines? Well, of course not. So we need to keep that in perspective there. Now, the last one I'll deal with here is the Jewish propagandist thing of the British in Palestine, or what was then Palestine, and later part of that became Israel. Now, certainly the ones that I've seen, they depict the British as being so brutal and so cruel and so evil that they make Hitler look like a fucking choir boy. They're clearly over the top, beyond belief over the top. The British are depicted as being brutal, murderous, arbitrary, evil to the triple nth degree. Now, I guess there's the main, if you sort of distill it, the main Jewish thing is that during the time of, say, the 1930s, when the British had this Palestine mandate, which they got in 1919, and they relinquished, I think, in 1947, 1948. When the British took the mandate, oil had become, remember the conversion from steam to oil had only really happened sort of 1890 onwards. So, and it was a slower sort of process. That oil-fired combustion engines were fairly new. So the relevance of oil in world geopolitics and world economics was only just starting to dawn on everybody. So it was early days for that. Not like today when, later on as it became. So you've got the Arabs in control of most of the world's oil reserves. Britain has no oil reserves. So if you're going to access oil, you've got to get it from the Middle East. Now, British grip or the the tenuous grip on the Middle East was such that the British couldn't afford to piss off the Arabs. The Arabs were definitely implacably opposed to there being a state of Israel. The British were trying to stay on good terms with the Arabs. Now, at the same time as this is happening, there's a worldwide depression, and the Nazis come to power in Germany, and they want to expel, well, not expel, but initially the Nazis asked the Jews to leave. We want you to leave Germany. So, and there were about 400,000 Jews in Germany, half of which were quite well qualified, or maybe not half, but guys like Einstein that were well qualified in anyone's view, who were able to easily get visas, but there are others who weren't. Now, what these Jews attempted to do was to leave Germany and just arrive at the shores of some other country, whether this be. Remember, Israel did not exist at the time, so that needs to be sort of kept in mind. So the Jews were just arriving, off New York Harbor or anywhere around the world. We're just arriving on a ship and demanding they be allowed access. And they've got no visas. They've got no, they're not legal immigrants in any sense of the word. And which is why the Jews today want this open borders thing, because they perceive that's the ultimate protection for themselves. But so the ships would be arriving probably from 1850, 1860 onwards in what was Palestine. There were a lot of Jews moving into what was the old area of, if you like, the area of the Israelites. If you go back in sort of ancient, even biblical terms, a lot of Jews arriving, and there was a lot of activity and a lot of talk about Zionism. That is, that the Jews should have a homeland, like a place, a Jewish state, and that's what Zionism means. So there was a lot of talk about this from the 1850s, 1860s onwards in the international media and the like. And so in the 1930s, the Jews started arriving, just unannounced, without approval, started arriving in those coastal ports along the Palestinian coast, near today, where you'd see places like Gaza and so on. And the British refused access, and well, no, you haven't got your documents, it was never approved. Where are your visas? And so would turn them away. This was viewed almost in biblical terms as the supreme outrage by the Jews or the Jewish activists. And that area in where around wider Jerusalem and so on, that area has always been a hotbed of drama, dissent, and carry on. The Roman emperors 2,000 years ago used to despair of the constant drama in the air, and Jewish assassins, knifing Roman government officials and so on, and then disappearing into the night. The professional assassin type thing was very much a Jewish gig going way back. And the same was happening with the British. So the constant attacks on military, but not just military bases, but on government officials and officers in their homes, and all this sort of stuff was constant. With, by the way, the Menachem Begin and Moshe Dayan and people that would later on be Israeli government political officials themselves were engaging in this and believed they had an absolute right to do it. Now, the British would turn those Jewish ships away, and so those ships would end up, because no one would take them, they'd end up going back to Germany, and as we all know, things didn't work out so good for them later on. But of the 400,000 German Jews in 1933, approximately 200,000, many of whom did actually survive the Nazi period, by the way, approximately 200,000 Jews were left in Germany. German Jews, were left in Germany. Now, as Germany moved into other areas of Europe, in the 1930s, there were some extra Jews there, but there weren't that many Jews in what was then Czechoslovakia. And it wasn't really until the Nazis invaded Poland that large numbers of Jews began to be acquired. I think there was something in the order of 3 million Jews in, approximately that number in Poland, for example. So that would have brought in, and also there are a number of Jews in Belarus and Ukraine when the Nazis invaded the Soviet Union. And there are a number of Romanian Jews as well, although the Nazis didn't, because Romania and Hungary were effectively German allies, they didn't push the point too much, though. Nonetheless, but earlier on, sort of between 1933 and 1939, the Jews that were looking to move were the Jews coming out of Germany, and again, about 200,000 in total were looking for some sort of alternative arrangements. But when they couldn't get visas or couldn't be granted visas by places like the United States, they just figured they'd turn up on the doorstep. And the British were refusing them access to Palestine, where if you like, the origins of the modern Jewish state were starting to be put together. Now, the Jews saw it as just anti-Jewish, but if you look at the British position, they've got a United Nations mandate to administer Palestine. There's already a lot of tension there from Jewish and Arab guerrillas and assassins running around trying to assassinate each other and so on. So this is already a hotbed of dissent. The Arabs are making it very plain to the British: if you want our oil, you need to handle this with the utmost delicacy. Not only the tensions in the area, but whether a Jewish state is created and so on. So the British were in just a no-win situation. But the Jewish propaganda, or certainly that I've seen, depict this very differently. It was the evil British Empire that was doing this, and they were effectively in league with the Nazis, if not worse. And so every Jewish ship with Jewish immigrants, every Jewish ship that was turned away. Remember, they're just arriving without papers, but they're just turning up saying, "We want to be here." So when the British turned those ships away, it was treated as a crime that was unimaginable. The Holocaust was because of England and Britain and the British Empire, and they were in effect Confederates to the Nazis. So there's that sort of vicious sort of that ginned up anger, and that therefore is the moral justification for murdering and assassinating any British officer or government official that the Jewish activists felt like murdering. So it's a bit of a stretch, that one, I think. Now, they also depict that because of all the murders and all the carry-on and the activists, the British started introducing curfews, saying that you had to, no one on the street after 8 o'clock at night, for example, whatever the curfew time was, I don't know what it was. So the Jews were running around placing, Jewish activists placing posters around on the streets. If the British caught them, they were interrogated, and as you can imagine, remember, people are being murdered on the street. So this is depicted as just young Jewish kids just sticking up for Jewishness, and those evil Nazi British just being so horrible again, making Hitler look like a choir boy. So this is outrageous, over-the-top propaganda, but it's all around making Britain and the British Empire and anything that is British, anything that's modern, white Western technology or organisation or judicial or whatever it is, making it's all bad, it's all evil, and anything that replaces it must be an improvement. You've been with Tacitus today, your Pushback channel, and thank you for listening.